right, let's just get right into it, because I promise you, the title of this thing is not clickbait. We are about to meet the original master of fake news, a literary troll who was doing his thing almost 2,000 years before the internet was even a flicker in anyone's imagination.
So, when I say science fiction, what's the first thing that pops into your head? You know, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, maybe? Some of those old-school pulp magazines with the cool rockets on the cover?
Yeah, you might want to think again. You're off by about, 1,800 years. The real story of how sci-fi started is, well, it's way pettier and honestly a whole lot funnier. It all begins with one man who was just completely and utterly fed up with everybody else's lies.
And here he is. His name is Lucian of Samosata. And listen, to call him a man ahead of his time is maybe the understatement of the century. This guy wasn't your typical ancient philosopher. He was more like an ancient provocateur.
I mean, Lucian's versatility is what really made him stand out. He wasn't just a one-trick pony. The guy wrote romance, he wrote criticism, and he wrote some of the most biting satire you can imagine. He was basically the world's first true man of letters, and his style feels so incredibly modern because he was obsessed with human stupidity, which, let's be real, never really goes out of style.
So Lucian looks around at the so-called intellectuals of his time, and all he sees is a bunch of frauds. He sees historians just making up heroic battles, poets spinning these ridiculous myths, and philosophers coming up with these absurd theories. And all of them were pretending to be telling the honest-to-God truth, and it drove him absolutely crazy.
And that frustration brings us to his absolute masterpiece. It's a work with one of the most brilliant, most paradoxical titles in all of literature, A True History.
His logic was so simple and just completely savage. He thought, okay, if the world is going to celebrate these liars who pretend to be truthful, then I'm going to become the greatest liar of all time, but I'm going to be honest about it. He basically decided to fight fire with a full-blown inferno of absurdity.
He lays his whole plan out right there in the book's preface. It is the ultimate mic drop. He is telling his readers straight up, everything you are about to read is a complete fabrication, and unlike those other guys, that makes me the only one telling you the truth about my lies.
So yeah, A True History is a parody, through and through. It's this elaborate, fantastical travel story, and its only purpose is to make a complete joke out of the so-called true stories of his time. It's a work of fiction designed to attack other works of fiction that were disguised as fact.
Okay, so if you're going to outlie everybody, you can't just tell little white lies, right? No, you have to go completely off the rails. And trust me, Lucian did. So let's take a quick peek inside this true history of his.
The list is just bonkers. His ship gets snatched up by a whirlwind and literally dumped on the moon, where they immediately get into an interstellar war against giant space spiders. They sail on a sea of milk, they find an island made entirely of cheese, they get swallowed by a 200-mile-long whale that has an entire society living inside of it, and they even travel to the underworld to interview dead celebrities. It is just relentlessly, gloriously absurd.
But here's the real kicker. None of this was random, not a single bit. Every one of these insane fantasies was a carefully aimed satirical missile.
This whole story was basically an epic book-length roast. It was a literary hit piece targeting the biggest names and intellectual fads of the ancient world. Lucian wasn't just telling some fun, weird story. No, he was settling scores.
And boy, was he specific. He calls out historians by name, like this guy Cressius, for their totally unbelievable accounts. He roasts the poets, starting with Homer himself, for what he calls the founding foolery of all heroic lies. But he saved his most potent venom for the philosophers, his dearest foes, as he called them, mocking their ridiculous theories every single chance he got.
This part is just pure genius. When he gets to the underworld, he sits down with the ghost of Homer for what is, essentially, the world's first ever celebrity interview. And his main question? So, which lines in your poems are actually fake? It's a journalistic takedown written 1,800 years before journalism was even a thing. So you might be thinking this is all just a funny, obscure book from ancient times, but you would be so wrong. Lucian's epic troll job didn't just fade into history, it basically created an entire genre. A True History became the model for using an imaginary voyage as a tool for satire. Lucian showed generations of writers that the absolute best way to critique your own society is to create a fantastical one and just hold it up like a mirror.
And you can literally trace this influence down through the centuries.
I mean, in the 16th century, Rabelais borrows heavily from him for Pantagruel. A century later, Cyrano de Bergerac writes his own trip to the moon. And then, in the 18th century, Jonathan Swift uses the exact same framework to create Gulliver's Travels, arguably the most famous satirical voyage of all time. They are all walking in Lucian's footsteps.
And what they all borrowed was Lucian's signature style, that sharp, biting wit, a sort of cheerful contempt for all his targets, and, most importantly, the ability to describe the most impossible things with a totally deadpan, straight-faced delivery that somehow makes it all feel weirdly believable. Which, brings us right back to today. We've just been talking about a book written in the 2nd century as a satirical attack on people who pass off fiction as fact. A story about a man who got so tired of fake news that he created the most fantastic fake news ever just to prove a point.
So if that feels familiar, if that feels like it could have been written yesterday, then the question you really have to ask yourself is, what has actually changed? And what does that say about the true histories we're all being sold right now? Something to think about.